In the quaint town of Texas, where the air always smelled faintly of pine and the streets were lined with cobblestones that whispered the secrets of generations, George McAllister worked tirelessly in his small, cluttered garage. His calloused hands moved with a precision that came from years of tinkering with gears and engines. A soft hum of music filled the space, a gentle reminder of the outside world that rarely intruded upon his solitary work. He was a man of few words, but his eyes, a deep shade of hazel, could speak volumes about his thoughts. The door to the garage creaked open, letting in a sliver of sunlight that danced across the floor. Olivia, his adoptive sister, stepped inside, her eyes searching for George. She was a stark contrast to the garage's ruggedness, with her flowing blonde hair and the graceful way she moved. She had always been the light to his shadow, the laughter to his solemnness. "Hey, Georgie," she called out, her voice echoing off the metal walls. George looked up from his work, wiping his brow with a greasy rag. He had known Olivia for as long as he could remember, raised alongside her in the McAllister household. Their bond was unshakable, a silent understanding that transcended the boundaries of siblings. But lately, something had shifted between them, a tension that neither could quite put into words. It was the day she had announced her engagement to Henry, a man George knew little about, that had changed everything. He felt a sting of jealousy, but he buried it deep, telling himself that he had moved on, that he had Ananta now. "Olivia," he said, his voice a mix of surprise and forced cheerfulness. "What brings you here?" Her smile was tentative as she approached him, clutching a small box. I wanted to talk to you," she began, her voice quivering slightly. She took a deep breath and held out the box. "It's something important." George took the box, his heart racing. Inside lay an exquisite necklace, the kind that whispered of love and promises. "What's this?" he asked, his voice thick with confusion and a hint of pain. "It's an apology," she said softly, "for not telling you sooner. I know you might not like Henry, but I hope you can be happy for me." George's gaze fell to the necklace, his thoughts tangled in a web of love and loyalty. He had always loved Olivia, but their paths had diverged, and now she was walking down an aisle with someone else. He looked back at her, his eyes searching for something, anything that could make this moment less surreal. "I'm happy for you," he managed to say, though the words tasted bitter. The lie hung in the air between them, a stark contrast to the harmony that once existed. Olivia's eyes searched his, looking for the truth, but George had become adept at hiding his feelings. She nodded, a single tear escaping down her cheek, and left the garage as silently as she had entered. George remained still, the necklace in his hand, a tangible reminder of what could have been. His engagement to Ananta was a beacon of hope in the chaos, a promise of a future where his love was not forbidden. Yet, as he stared at the delicate trinket, he couldn't help but wonder if he was truly ready to let go of the past. The days leading up to Olivia's wedding were a blur of forced smiles and awkward small talk. George found solace in his work, the rhythmic clanking of tools and the roar of engines a welcome distraction from the emotional turmoil that churned within him. He threw himself into preparing for his own wedding, planning every detail meticulously with Ananta, who remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing in his heart. On the day of the ceremony, George stood tall in his tuxedo, watching as Olivia walked down the aisle towards Henry. Her eyes met his for a brief moment, and he saw a flicker of something unspoken. Regret, perhaps? Or maybe it was just his imagination, playing cruel tricks on his weary soul. The wedding went on as planned, a whirlwind of laughter and tears that George felt only on the surface. As the night grew darker, the air grew colder, and the stars twinkled in the velvet sky, George found himself unable to ignore the gnawing feeling that he had made a mistake. His thoughts drifted to Olivia, lost in the sea of unexplored emotions she had stirred within him. The reception was a cacophony of voices and music, a stark contrast to the silence in George's heart. He watched as Olivia and Henry danced, their bodies moving in perfect harmony. The sight was both beautiful and painful, a reminder of the love he had never been allowed to claim. But he knew he had to move on. He had Ananta now, a woman who loved him openly and without reservation. As George took a deep breath, preparing to join the celebration and bury his feelings once and for all, Olivia's hand slipped into his. Her eyes searched his, a silent question hanging between them. In that moment, the walls he had so carefully constructed around his heart began to crumble. The music grew louder, the voices a distant murmur as George and Olivia danced. Her hand felt right in his, her laughter echoing in his soul. But it was a bittersweet symphony, a reminder of the love they could never share. The night ended with a promise that they would always be there for each other, that their bond would never truly be broken. But as George held Ananta close in his arms, watching the stars twinkle above, he knew that the love between him and Olivia was a chapter that had to remain closed. It was a promise of a future filled with love and pain, a future that neither of them could predict, but one that George was determined to face with courage and an open heart. The following weeks were a flurry of activity as George and Ananta prepared for their own wedding day. He threw himself into planning, eager to leave the shadows of his past behind. The garage saw less of him, and the necklace remained tucked away, a silent testament to the love he could never fully let go. One evening, as George sat in his office, going over the guest list for the umpteenth time, a soft knock on the door made him look up. Olivia stood in the doorway, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She looked at him, her heart in shambles, and finally spoke the words that had been left unsaid for so long. "George," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I think I made a mistake." The revelation hit him like a ton of bricks. He had accepted her engagement, had even started to build a life with Ananta, but now, as he looked into her eyes, the depth of his feelings for Olivia rushed back like a tidal wave. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I don't know if I can marry Henry," she confessed, her voice barely audible. "I think I love you, George. I think I always have." The room spun around him, and for a moment, George was unable to breathe. This was the moment he had both dreaded and longed for. The choice lay before him, stark and unforgiving. Hold on to the love he had always felt for Olivia or honor the commitment he had made to Ananta. He took a deep breath, his hand shaking as he reached for hers. "We'll figure it out," he said, though the words felt like a lie. Together, they stepped into the darkness, the path ahead of them fraught with uncertainty. Olivia's words hung in the air, a confession that George never thought he would hear. He felt a whirlwind of emotions, torn between his loyalty to Ananta and the love he had always held for Olivia. With trembling hands, Olivia reached up to him, her touch light and feather-like. She whispered sweet nothings into his ear, her breath warm against his skin. He knew what she was doing, trying to seduce him into making a choice that would irrevocably change their lives. His heart hammered in his chest, torn between the right thing and the easy thing. But George was a man of honor, and he knew that he could not betray Ananta. He stepped back, gently but firmly removing her hands from his body. "No, Olivia," he said, his voice resolute. "This isn't right." Her eyes searched his, desperation and pain mingling in their depths. "But what if it's what we both want?" she pleaded. "What if we're meant to be together?" George took a deep, shaky breath. "We can't do this," he said. "We can't hurt Ananta." But Olivia's eyes, brimming with unshed tears, held a determination that George had never seen before. She stepped closer, her hands sliding around his waist. "I know you love me," she murmured. "You always have." Their eyes locked, and for a moment, George felt himself sway. Her scent, so familiar yet so forbidden, enveloped him, and the walls that had held his feelings at bay for so long began to crack. With a groan that was equal parts anguish and desire, he pulled her closer, kissing her with a passion that seemed to burn through the very fabric of his soul. The decision to resist had been made, but in the heat of the moment, he found that he could not resist the siren call of his heart. The night passed in a blur of whispers and touches, a dance of passion that George had never allowed himself to imagine with Olivia. As the first light of dawn crept into the room, illuminating the tangled sheets and the two bodies entwined, reality began to seep back into his consciousness. He knew what he had done was wrong. that he had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The following day, George found himself unable to look Ananta in the eye. The weight of his betrayal sat heavy on his shoulders, a burden that grew with every moment that ticked by. He knew he had to tell her, had to come clean about the tumultuous emotions that had led him into Olivia's arms. The words felt like shards of glass in his throat as he confessed his infidelity, watching the light in her eyes dim as she realized the extent of his deceit. Ananta's reaction was not one of anger, but of profound sadness. She had seen the way George looked at Olivia, had felt the tension between them, but had never dreamed it would come to this. With trembling hands, she returned the ring he had given her, her voice barely a whisper. "I can't marry you," she said, her eyes filling with tears. "Not when you love someone else." The wedding was called off, and the town of Texas buzzed with the scandal. George felt like a man drowning in a sea of his own making, unable to escape the waves of guilt that crashed over him. He had lost the woman he had promised to cherish. And for what? A fleeting moment of passion with the woman he had always loved, but could never truly have. The days turned into weeks, and the garage, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. Every time George picked up a tool, he was reminded of the lie he had told himself, of the happiness he had shattered. He knew he had to make amends, to find a way to live with the choices he had made. And so, George faced the woman who had been his confidant, his light, and now his ultimate regret. Olivia, her eyes swollen from crying, looked at him with a mix of hope and fear. "What do we do now?" she whispered. He took her hand, feeling the weight of her emotions in her trembling touch. "We move forward," he said, his voice firm. "We face the consequences of our actions and learn to live with them." But the path ahead was anything but clear. The bond between George and Olivia remained, a taut thread of love and pain that connected them despite the distance they had tried to put between themselves. And as they ventured into the unknown, each step felt heavier than the last. The twist came one fateful evening, as whispers grew into accusations that George had not seen coming. Olivia, consumed by embarrassment and shame, had spun a web of deceit that George never would have anticipated. She had told Henry that George had sexually assaulted her, painting a picture of herself as the victim of a monstrous brother's twisted love. The town of Texas, known for its tight-knit community, was now a minefield of accusatory glances and hushed judgments. Henry, a man of pride and a fierce protector, was incensed. He didn't believe Olivia's fabricated story, but the damage was done. Her tears and the raw emotion she portrayed convinced him that something was amiss, though not the truth she had presented. The engagement was called off, and George's reputation lay in tatters, a mere shadow of the man he once was. The confrontation between Henry and George was inevitable. It unfolded in the dimly lit garage, where George had found so much solace over the years. Henry's fists clenched, his eyes dark with anger. "What did you do to her?" he roared, the sound echoing through the space. George, bruised and bloodied from the relentless onslaught, tried to explain. "It's not what you think," he panted, his words punctuated by grunts of pain. "We talked, we kissed, it was her decision," his voice hoarse. "But it's over. It's always been just a mess of feelings we couldn't sort out." Henry's fists didn't stop flying. Each blow landed with a thud that seemed to resonate through George's very soul. "You took advantage of her," he spat, his eyes wild. "My sweet, innocent Olivia." The garage door flung open, and a crowd of townsfolk spilled in, drawn by the commotion. They saw George on the ground, Henry standing over him, and Olivia in the corner weeping. The narrative was clear in their minds. George had taken his twisted obsession too far. They didn't need to hear the details. The scene spoke for itself. "Stop!" someone shouted as more people crowded in, and the air grew thick with accusation. Hands grabbed Henry, pulling him back as George struggled to stand. "What happened here?" The town's sheriff, a burly man with a stern gaze, pushed his way through the throng. The whispers grew louder, the accusations more vicious. "Look what he did to her," someone said, pointing at Olivia. She looked small and fragile in the corner, mascara streaking down her face. George felt the noose of the town's judgment tightening around his neck. "It's not what it looks like," George managed to croak out, his face a mess of bruises. But the townsfolk had made up their minds. They had always seen him as the quiet, brooding type, and now they had a reason to believe the worst. The sheriff's gaze swept over the garage, taking in the chaotic scene. His eyes narrowed as they fell on Olivia, her face a canvas of despair, and George, the picture of defeat. He took a step forward, handcuffs jingling. "I think it's time we had a chat down at the station, George." But Olivia, the picture of innocence, rushed to his side, her eyes shimmering with fresh tears. "No," she said, her voice trembling. "Please, it's not what it seems." Her words hung in the air, a stark contrast to the accusations that had filled the room. The townspeople looked from George, who was still struggling to stand, to Olivia, who was now the center of attention. Her face was a mask of pain, and for a moment, George felt a flicker of hope that she had realized the gravity of their situation. But as she continued to speak, her voice grew stronger, more convincing. "George has always been there for me, always protected me," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "Even though he did unspeakable things to me, I still forgive him," she said, playing the victim. The crowd's shock was palpable, and George felt the color drain from his face. This was not the confession he had been expecting. It was a twist that painted him as the villain, a role he had never wanted. Olivia whispered, turning to George. "But even though he did those things to me, I forgive him. He's my brother, and I love him." The words hit George like a sucker punch. He had never hurt Olivia, had never dreamed of taking advantage of her. Yet here she was playing the victim, making him out to be the monster. It was a lie so convincing that even he almost believed it. The sheriff's hand hovered over the handcuffs, his gaze flickering between George and Olivia. "I think we need to have a talk," he said, his voice low and serious. "Both of you." George knew he was in a no-win situation. If he defended himself, it would only make him look guiltier. If he stayed silent, Olivia's lie would become their truth. He felt a cold dread seep into his bones, the realization that the life he had tried so hard to build was now crumbling around him. With a heavy heart, George allowed the sheriff to lead him out of the garage, the whispers of the townsfolk following him like a funeral procession. He glanced back at Olivia, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears, and wondered how they had come to this. How could the person he had loved for so long, the person who knew him better than anyone, be the one to betray him in the end? The walk to the sheriff's office was a blur, the weight of Olivia's words dragging him down with every step. As they sat in the stark, white room, the silence between them was deafening. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall, counting down the moments until George's fate was sealed.